The hand stayed out for 4 seconds. Not long, in the ordinary accounting of time. Long enough, in a room with 11 witnesses, to mean something precise. Adeze Nwosu kept her hand extended for all 4 seconds. Not out of hope, not out of stubbornness, but because withdrawing it prematurely would have been an acknowledgement of what was happening, and she had no intention of acknowledging it before the room did. She had been an architect for 18 years. She had been in rooms like this for most of them. She had learned that the space between an extended hand and a refusal was a test, and that the test was not hers. Raymond Holt withdrew from the handshake by looking away, not at her, not at the room, but at some middle distance beside her left shoulder that he had decided to find interesting. His hands moved to the conference table's edge instead. He said something to the man beside him, quiet and sideways, the conversation of someone who had decided the interaction in front of them was not occurring. The contract on the table in front of him had been signed 38 minutes ago. His signature was on page 47. Adeze Nwosu's name, Principal Architect, Nwosu Partners, appeared on the cover page, the authorization clause, and 14 other places throughout the document, as it had been from the first draft 3 months ago, as it had been in the request for proposals Raymond's company had issued 8 months ago, as it had been in every meeting and document and email of the 8 months this project had taken to reach this table. He had known her name. He had not, until this moment, had to shake her hand. Adeze understood the arithmetic of this in the specific way of someone who had been doing it for 18 years, the name on paper, the voice on calls, the presentation slides, the portfolio, the references. All of it had been processed through a filter that had been, until she walked into the room, free to run whatever image it wanted alongside her name. She had walked in. The filter had updated. And Raymond Holt had made a decision, in the fraction of a second available to him, that told her more about the next 18 months of this project than any contract clause could. She lowered her hand. She sat down. She opened her project binder. She had work to do. Adeze Nwosu had grown up in Enugu, Nigeria, the eldest daughter of a civil engineer father and a secondary school mathematics teacher mother who had together produced, in the Nwosu household, an atmosphere of such consistent problem-solving that their children had grown up understanding buildings not as things that existed, but as things that were made by specific decisions, in specific sequences, by people who understood what they were doing and why. Her father had taken her to construction sites from the time she could walk, pointing out the decisions embedded in each joint and beam and foundation pour. She had understood before adolescence that the built environment was not neutral. Every building was an argument about what mattered and who mattered and what should last. She had come to the United States for her graduate degree at the University of Pennsylvania, stayed for a firm, stayed for a second firm, started her own practice at 37 with 2 junior architects and a portfolio that had taken 11 years to build. The 11 years had not been easy in the ways specific to being a black woman in a profession that was, statistically, one of the least diverse in the country. Not diverse in its educational pipeline, not diverse in its partnerships, not diverse in the commissions that reached the offices that had the resources to pursue them. She had navigated this the way she navigated structural problems in design, by understanding the constraints completely before deciding which ones were fixed and which ones could be moved. Some constraints were fixed. You worked around them. Some could be moved. You moved them. The skill was in knowing the difference, without spending time being surprised by either. The firm had grown to 12 people in 5 years. Her projects were civic in scale and precise in execution: libraries, cultural centers, mixed-use buildings in neighborhoods that had been underinvested for decades, and that required an architect who understood not just the technical requirements, but the social ones. She had developed a community engagement methodology that was, among the city's development offices and nonprofit partners who worked with her, considered the standard against which other processes were measured. Not because it was elaborate, it was not, but because it was genuine, which was harder to manufacture than elaboration, and produced results that elaboration could not. The Holt development contract was the largest in Nuosu Partners' history. $43 million. A mixed-use development in a mid-city neighborhood, residential, retail, community space, that Raymond Holt's company had been developing in response to a city redevelopment mandate that required meaningful community benefit provisions. The mandate was real but vague, and the city had selected Nuosu Partners as the project architect specifically because of Adezi's track record with community benefit design, her community process experience, her understanding of what the neighborhood actually needed as opposed to what satisfied the mandate's technical requirements. The city had selected her. Raymond Holt had inherited her selection. He had been professional throughout. That was the precise word, professional. He had attended every required meeting. He had responded to every required communication. He had reviewed every submission on the required timeline. He had done all of this with the specific efficiency of a man fulfilling obligations he had not chosen and was not going to exceed. He had never said her name incorrectly. He had never been late. He had never given her direct cause for complaint. He had also never once spoken to her as if she were the person whose vision was shaping the building he was paying for. In 8 months of project development, Adeze had learned to read the texture of Raymond Holt's engagement the way she read a building's structural drawings, looking for where the load was actually being carried, and where the gaps had been papered over with something that looked like support but wasn't. He addressed his questions to her project manager, David, when David was in the room. He CC'd David on emails to her. In the 3 presentations she had given to his development team, he had directed follow-up questions to her male junior architects. Once, during a materials review, he had asked the junior architect whether he thought the specified cladding was the right choice for the building's northwest exposure. A question that was Adezi's to answer, about a decision she had made, using knowledge the junior architect had acquired from watching her make it. The junior architect had looked at Adeze. Adeze had answered the question. Raymond had nodded and moved to the next agenda item as if the routing had been unremarkable. He had done none of this with visible aggression. He had done it with the practiced invisibility of a man who had been doing it for long enough that he no longer needed to think about it. It had become the architecture of how he operated. As invisible to him as the load-bearing walls in a building he had never had to think about, because they had always held. She had documented all of it, not as grievance, as data, in the same project notebook she kept for every project, in the same handwriting she used for site observations and material specifications, alongside the dates and the descriptions, exact language, exact context, exact witnesses. She kept these notes not because she planned to act on them immediately, but because she had learned, 18 years ago at her first American firm, that the difference between a complaint and a case was documentation, and that you built documentation the way you built a foundation, before you needed it to hold weight. She had 3 months of a very specific foundation by the time she walked into the signing meeting and extended her hand. The project kicked off the week after the signing. Raymond's behavior did not change. If anything, the contract's execution, the reality of 18 months of required collaboration, had tightened it, as if the handshake refusal had been a clarification he had needed to make before the work began. He continued addressing David. He continued the CC patterns. In the first site meeting, he turned his back to her mid-sentence to ask a structural engineer a question that could have waited 90 seconds. She continued documenting. she continued designing. She continued running the project with the precision and care it deserved, because the project was a $43 million building in a neighborhood that had been waiting for investment, and the people who lived there did not deserve a diminished version of it, because her client was a man who couldn't look at her when she spoke. She also continued the community engagement process, the 4 sessions she had built into the project timeline, the ones that were the reason the city had selected her, the ones Raymond attended because they were in the project schedule and left the moment they ended. She ran these sessions the way she ran all of her community engagement, not as consultation theater, where the forms were filled out and the boxes checked, and the residents' input was absorbed into a process that had already decided what it wanted. Actual listening. The kind where you changed the design based on what you heard, and then came back and showed them what had changed, and listened to what they thought of the change. The residents learned her name, not the architect or the firm or the person the city had sent. Adaeze. They brought their children to the sessions. One woman, a retired schoolteacher named Josephine, who had lived in the neighborhood for 41 years, brought photographs of what the block had looked like before the last round of development had taken away the courtyard where people had gathered. Adaeze had looked at the photographs for a long time, and then gone back to the design and found the space for something that wasn't in the original program. Raymond Holt never knew about the photographs or what they had changed in the design. He didn't ask. 3 months in, she made a phone call. Not to a lawyer. Not yet. To Eleanor Reyes, the city's director of community development, who had overseen the redevelopment mandate and the architect selection process, and who had been the one to tell Adaeze, when the contract was awarded, that the city had chosen Nwosu Partners specifically because the community needed an architect who would actually listen to them. Eleanor had been on 2 of the project's community engagement sessions. She had seen Adaeze run them, the way she moved through a room, the way she asked questions, the way she held space for residents who had been told their opinions didn't matter for long enough to have stopped offering them. Adaeze described what had been happening. She used the documentation, dates, specific incidents, patterns. She did not editorialize. She presented the information the way she presented a building's structural analysis. Here is what the data shows. Here is what it means for the structure. Here is what needs to happen to keep the building sound. Eleanor listened. She asked 4 questions. Then she said, "Is the design work being affected?" "Not yet," Adaeze said, "but the pattern is escalating. 3 months in, with 15 to go, it will be. What do you need from me?" "A meeting. You, me, Raymond Holt, before month 4. The meeting happened 10 days later in Eleanor's office at the city's development authority, not a neutral room, a city room, with Eleanor's mandate on the wall and the redevelopment requirements in the filing cabinets behind her desk. Raymond Holt arrived with his project manager. He did not appear to know why he had been summoned, which was by design. Eleanor had framed the meeting as a project check-in, which it also was. Eleanor ran the meeting. She reviewed the community benefit provisions and the project's progress against them. She asked Adaeze to walk through the design development status. Adaeze walked through it, comprehensive, specific. The work itself speaking with the authority of 18 months of professional precision. Raymond's project manager took notes. Raymond watched a point 2 feet above Adaeze's head. Then Eleanor set down her pen and looked at Raymond directly. "I want to speak plainly," she said. "The city selected Nwosu Partners for this project because of the quality of their work, and because of Adaeze Nwosu's specific experience and vision. Not the firm generally. Her specifically. The community benefit provisions in your contract are only achievable if the architect of record is fully empowered to make design decisions. I need to know that's happening." Raymond said, The project is on schedule. That's not what I asked, Eleanor said. I asked whether the architect of record is fully empowered. A pause. The kind that contained a recalculation. Yes, he said. Good, Eleanor said. Because if the project runs into community benefit deficiencies at the 18-month review, the city has remediation authority under the mandate, including the authority to review the development agreement. She paused. I want us all to be clear on that before we get further in. She said it without hostility and without emphasis. She said it the way you say a fact that everyone in the room needs to have heard clearly, which was what it was. Not a threat, a term. The same kind of term that appeared on page 47 of the contract Raymond had signed, in the neutral contractual language that said what was true, without inflection. Raymond Holt looked at Adeze for the first time in the meeting, directly, with the specific attention of a man who had just understood that the architecture of the room had changed, that the person he had spent 3 months looking past was the load-bearing wall he had been treating as decorative. The architect of record, he said carefully, has full design authority. Thank you, Eleanor said. I'll note that for the record. Adeze said nothing. She had said what she needed to say 3 weeks ago, on a phone call, using data she had been collecting for 3 months. Eleanor had said the rest. The project's remaining 15 months were different, not transformed. Raymond Holt did not become a different person, and Adeze was not interested in his transformation. What she was interested in was the work, and the work required a client who addressed her directly. The client now addressed her directly. He came to site meetings and engaged with the design decisions. He stopped routing questions through David. He did all of this with the slightly self-conscious precision of a man performing a correction, which was exactly what it was. She documented the change the same way she documented everything else: dates, behaviors, patterns, not as vindication, as data. The foundation she had built in the first 3 months held the weight of the next 15. That was what foundations were for. The building was completed on schedule. It opened in April, a Tuesday afternoon ceremony with the mayor, the city council member whose district it sat in, Eleanor Reyes, and 400 residents who had attended the community engagement sessions and whose input was visible in the building's form. The community room was on the ground floor, accessible from the street, sized for the programs the residents had named. The retail spaces had been designed for the small businesses the neighborhood's own surveys had prioritized. The residential floors were mixed income in the specific proportions the mandate required, and the design made dignified rather than segregated. And at the center of the ground floor plan, opening from the lobby into a sheltered exterior space that the original program had not included, was a courtyard, not large, but sufficient, with seating and plantings and the proportions of a place where people could gather. Josephine, the retired schoolteacher, had brought photographs of the old courtyard that the last round of development had taken away. Adeze had looked at those photographs and gone back to the design and found the space. The courtyard was not in the original budget. She had found the budget in the material savings from a structural simplification on the upper floors. Raymond Holt had reviewed the change order and approved it without comment, because by the time it reached him the behavior had changed and the design authority was hers, and there was nothing to object to in the numbers. Josephine was at the ceremony, in the front row. When Adeze walked past her before the remarks began, she reached out and took her hand. Both hands, the way elders do, and said simply, "You listened." "You told me what was needed," Adeze said. "Yes," Josephine said, "but you listened." Raymond Holt gave a brief speech at the ceremony. He acknowledged the city's mandate. He acknowledged the development team. He said, and we want to thank Nuosu Partners, and particularly Adise Nuosu, for the quality of the design work. He looked at her when he said it. Briefly, correctly, the way a man looks at someone he is required to acknowledge. She accepted the acknowledgement with the same expression she had worn when she lowered her hand 18 months ago. Not warm, not cold. The specific neutral of a professional who has done the work and does not require more from the moment than the moment contains. She had not built this building for Raymond Holt's acknowledgement. She had built it for the 400 people in the room whose names she knew and whose programs were on the ground floor, and whose neighborhood now had a building that told them their future was worth investing in. Her mother had called the night before the opening from Enugu, where it was already morning. "Tell me about the building," she said. Adese told her. The community room, accessible from the street. The retail for the businesses the residents had named. The mixed-income floors designed with dignity. The light through the east windows in the morning, which she had calculated specifically for the common spaces, because people deserved good light. Her mother listened. When she finished, her mother said, "Your father would have walked every floor." "I know," Adese said. "I walked them twice." "Of course you did," her mother said. "You always do." She did. Adese Nuosu always walked every floor of her buildings before they opened, from basement to roof. Every space, every finish, every place where a decision she had made had become physical reality. She walked them the way her father had walked construction sites, looking at the decisions embedded in the joints and beams and foundation pours, reading the argument the building was making about what mattered and who mattered and what should last. She had walked this one alone on a Monday morning before the ceremony. Starting in the basement, working up the community room first, checking the proportions against the model she had built in her first week of the project. The ceiling height that gave it the quality of a serious room rather than a converted storage space. Because the programs that would happen here were serious. The retail corridor, the finishes she had specified and argued for against a value engineering pressure that would have made them cheaper and worse. The residential floors, each unit with the cross-ventilation she had calculated specifically for this building's orientation and this neighborhood's summer wind patterns, because people deserved to be comfortable in their homes. The courtyard last. She had stood in it for a long time. The proportions were right, not by accident, but by the kind of iteration that took 3 designs and 2 structural reviews to arrive at. The plantings were not yet grown, but she could see what they would become. The seating was made of a material she had researched for 6 weeks because it needed to hold up to 40 years of weather and still be worth sitting on. She had sat on it, in the empty courtyard, in the morning before the city had woken up around her. She had thought about Josephine's photographs, about the old courtyard, gone, about this one, built in its place. Then, she had walked back down to the lobby, through all the floors, from the ground up this time, and she had been ready. This one said, "You matter. You were worth building for." That was the argument she had come to make. She had made it. The building would make it every day to everyone who walked through its doors, long after the signing meeting, and the 4 seconds, and the hand that had stayed out and been refused. Long after all of it, the building would remain, making the argument in the only language that lasts. Stone, and glass, and light. And a courtyard where people could gather. Hers,